Julia Carter stepped out of the subway onto the cool stone pavement of Midtown Manhattan just as the city was fully waking up. Traffic hummed along the avenue. Coffee carts steamed the corners, and the glass towers around her reflected a pale morning light. She paused for a moment across the street from the headquarters of Titanium Holdings, lifting her eyes to the upper floors of the building. The structure was sleek and imposing, all steel and glass, the kind of place that made people instinctively straighten their backs before walking inside. This was it, the internship selection that hundreds had applied for, and only a handful would survive. Inside the lobby, the air felt different, quieter, controlled, expensive. Security badges were scanned, names checked, and candidates were directed toward a waiting area on one of the upper floors. Julia followed the signs, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She kept her posture steady, even though her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. The waiting room was already crowded. Young men and women sat in neat rows, some reviewing resumes on tablets, others staring straight ahead as if rehearsing confidence. Julia recognized the familiar tension immediately. Everyone here knew the odds. Everyone here believed they deserved one of the few spots available. She took an empty seat near the window and glanced around. A brunette with sharp features and a perfectly tailored blazer sat a few chairs away, tapping her pen against a leather folder with visible impatience. Julia would later learn her name was Rebecca Stone, but even now, Rebecca's presence carried a sense of quiet competitiveness. Not far from her, a woman with softer features and an open expression offered a polite smile to anyone who met her eyes. When their gazes crossed, she nodded slightly. "I'm Olivia," the woman said in a low voice, leaning closer. "First time applying here?" "Yes," Julia replied. "Julia." "Same," Olivia said. "Feels intense, doesn't it?" Julia exhaled and allowed herself a small smile. That's one way to put it. Around them, conversations were hushed and fragmented. No one wanted to reveal too much. No one wanted to appear uncertain. The unspoken truth hung heavily in the room. Only a few would leave here with offers. The rest would walk back into the city, carrying quiet disappointment. After several minutes, the side doors opened. The room fell silent almost instantly. A woman entered with measured steps, her presence commanding attention without effort. She was impeccably dressed, her posture rigid, her expression cool and unreadable. This was Catherine Carter, the deputy CEO of Titanium Holdings. Her reputation preceded her, disciplined, uncompromising, and intolerant of mistakes. She stopped at the front of the room and surveyed the candidates with a single, assessing glance. "Good morning," Catherine said, her voice calm and firm. "I'll keep this brief." She informed them that there would be no interviews, no personal presentations, no attempts to impress through charm or rehearsed answers. The selection would be based entirely on academic records, professional recommendations, and documented performance. A subtle ripple of tension passed through the room. "We value discipline here," Catherine continued. "Punctuality is not optional. Professional boundaries are absolute. There will be no workplace intrigues, no favoritism, and no personal relationships of any kind." Her gaze lingered for a moment, as if daring anyone to question her. "Those who are selected will be informed shortly," she concluded. "The rest are free to leave." The doors closed behind her as quickly as they had opened. Minutes passed that felt longer than they were. Names were called in a controlled, emotionless manner. Each name carried weight, relief for some, quiet defeat for others. When Julia heard her own name, her breath caught for a split second. She stood, smoothing her jacket, and met Olivia's eyes. Olivia's name followed shortly after. Rebecca's did not. By the time the list ended, 6 candidates remained. Julia left the building later that morning with the city stretching wide in front of her. The noise, the movement, The endless possibility of New York seemed suddenly brighter. She felt hopeful, proud, and determined. She had earned this opportunity. What she did not know, what she could not possibly know, was that this ordinary morning, filled with nerves and ambition, had quietly set something irreversible in motion. By the time evening settled over Manhattan, the tension of the morning had loosened its grip. Messages circulated among the newly selected interns, and a simple suggestion quickly became a plan. Someone knew a place, somewhere exclusive, somewhere worth celebrating. Julia read the invitation on her phone while sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment. She had already changed into comfortable clothes, her hair loose, the adrenaline of the day finally ebbing. Her first instinct was to decline. The day had been long, emotionally draining, and she had never been someone who felt at ease in loud, crowded spaces filled with strangers. But as the minutes passed, doubt crept in. She was new, unknown. Turning down the invitation might set her apart in the wrong way. She did not want to be labeled distant, difficult, or uninterested before she had even begun. After a brief pause, Julia typed a short reply. She would come, just for a little while. The nightclub was tucked behind an unmarked door in one of Manhattan's most expensive districts. Inside, the world shifted instantly. Music pulsed through the room in deep, rhythmic waves. Lights flashed and scattered across mirrored walls, catching on sequin dresses and polished glasses. The air was heavy with perfume, alcohol, and heat. Julia stepped inside with the others and felt the atmosphere wrap around her. Olivia laughed easily, already blending into the crowd. Even Rebecca, distant and sharp earlier that day, appeared animated here, her movements confident, her smile carefully practiced. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes. Someone lifted a glass in a spontaneous toast. Julia accepted one, the cold stem steady between her fingers. She told herself she would sip slowly. She told herself she would leave early. The music grew louder. Conversations blurred. The champagne loosened the tight edges of the day, softening the careful control Julia usually kept around herself. She laughed more freely than she expected. She danced, tentatively at first, then with growing ease as the rhythm carried her. It happened suddenly. She turned, distracted by a voice calling her name, and felt her arm jolt. The champagne slipped from her grasp, the pale liquid splashing across the front of a man standing directly behind her. Time seemed to pause. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket that now bore unmistakable evidence of the accident. Julia froze, heat rushing to her face. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately, her voice nearly lost beneath the music. "I didn't see you." She stopped when he smiled. It was not the tight, irritated smile she expected. It was easy, amused, almost curious. His eyes, strikingly blue, studied her with calm interest rather than annoyance. "Looks like my jacket didn't survive the night," he said lightly. "I'll pay for the cleaning," Julia insisted, already reaching for her bag. "Please. It was completely my fault." He shook his head. "It's fine. Really." Something in his tone disarmed her. They moved slightly away from the center of the dance floor, close enough to talk without shouting. He took another glass from a passing tray and handed it to her as if the interruption had been intentional. They introduced themselves only by first names. The conversation flowed with unexpected ease. He asked about her day. She gave a brief, careful answer. He listened closely, his attention steady and focused in a way that made the rest of the room fade. They drank. They laughed. At some point, they were dancing again, closer now, the space between them narrowing naturally, without effort or planning. Julia was acutely aware of him, the warmth of his presence, the confidence in the way he moved, the quiet intensity in his gaze. The attraction was immediate and overwhelming, cutting through reason with unsettling clarity. Julia knew this was not like her. She knew she should step back, return to the group, remind herself of tomorrow, of responsibility, of restraint. Instead, she felt herself leaning forward, drawn in by the unfamiliar pull of impulse. When she spoke, the words surprised even her. "Do you want to get out of here?" For a brief moment, he searched her face, as if giving her one last chance to reconsider. Then he nodded, and just like that, the decision was made. The ride through Midtown passed in a blur of streetlights and reflections sliding across the car windows. Manhattan at night felt distant, almost unreal, as if the city itself had stepped aside and allowed something private to unfold. Julia sat beside the stranger, aware of the steady presence at her side, the quiet certainty with which he spoke to the driver, the way his hand briefly brushed hers when the car turned. The hotel rose above the street like a polished monument, glass, marble, muted gold lighting. Inside, everything moved with smooth efficiency. The lobby was hushed despite the late hour, the air cool and faintly scented. Julia followed him across the floor, her heels clicking softly, her pulse loud in her ears. She told herself she could still stop. She told herself this was a line she had never crossed before. The elevator doors closed. The space felt suddenly smaller. The tension that had been building since the club tightened, sharpened. When he looked at her, there was no uncertainty in his expression, only a quiet question. Julia answered it without speaking. The kiss came first, unhurried but certain, dissolving the last fragile barrier of restraint she had been holding on to. Inside the room, the city stretched beyond the windows in a grid of lights. The door closed behind them, sealing the world outside. Passion escalated quickly, almost inevitably. Julia was aware, with an unsettling clarity, that she was stepping outside the version of herself she had carefully built. She knew the rules she lived by. She knew the risks. And yet, in that moment, she did not stop. The night unfolded in a series of intense, intimate moments. Touch and movement, whispered words that carried no promises, only presence. There was an emotional charge beneath the physical closeness, something raw and unexpected that made the hours feel suspended in time. Julia felt seen in a way that surprised her, felt a connection she had not anticipated and had not prepared for. At some point, exhaustion softened the edges of everything. The city lights blurred. Sleep came quietly. Morning arrived without ceremony. Julia woke, first to pale light filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the distant hum of traffic far below. Feeling the warmth beside her, reality returned in fragments. The building, the room, the unfamiliar weight of what she had done. She turned her head and looked at the man sleeping beside her. In the clarity of daylight, his features were calm, unguarded. And yet, a sharp awareness settled over her. She did not know his last name. She did not know anything beyond the version of him that had existed in dim light and music. A familiar tightening formed in her chest. Carefully, Julia slipped out of bed and gathered her clothes. She moved quietly, deliberately, as if sound itself might force her to confront what she was trying to avoid. In the bathroom, she studied her reflection. Her hair was loose, her eyes darker than usual, a faint trace of the night still visible on her skin. This was not who she was supposed to be. She dressed slowly, her movements precise, controlled. On the small desk near the window, she found a notepad. After a brief hesitation, she wrote a short message. Nothing revealing, nothing personal, just a few polite words, an apology for leaving early, a quiet goodbye. She did not sign it with anything more than her first name. When she stepped back into the room, she paused once more. He had not stirred. For a fleeting second, she considered waking him, saying something, asking something. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Questions would only complicate what already felt dangerously close to regret. Julia placed the note where it would be seen and picked up her bag. The elevator ride down felt longer than before. By the time she reached the street, the city had fully awakened. Morning traffic surged past. People hurried along sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, eyes forward. Life continued, indifferent to what had happened a few floors above. As she walked away from the hotel, Julia forced her breathing to steady. She framed the night the only way she could manage. It had been a mistake, an impulsive lapse brought on by pressure, exhaustion, and the release of a day that had changed everything. A one-night escape, nothing more. She told herself she would forget it. She told herself it would never matter. And with that belief firmly in place, Julia disappeared into the crowd, unaware of how fragile that certainty truly was. Julia arrived at Titanium Holdings earlier than necessary. Driven by a restless determination she could not quiet. The city outside was still shaking off the last traces of dawn when she stepped into the building, coffee untouched in her hand. Her thoughts fixed firmly on one goal, work. If she focused hard enough, if she kept herself disciplined and invisible, yesterday would stay where it belonged. In the past, the elevator carried her upward in silence. When the doors opened, the familiar precision of the office floor greeted her. Muted colors, clean lines, glass walls that reflected a version of herself she barely recognized. Composed, professional, untouched. Interns were already gathering in the designated conference room. Low conversations filled the space, restrained but eager. Julia took a seat near the end of the table, carefully arranging her notebook and pen as if the order might steady her thoughts. Olivia sat nearby and offered a quick smile. Julia returned it, grateful for the small, grounding connection. She kept her gaze forward. She did not look around for anyone else. The minutes passed slowly. Then, without warning, the room fell silent. The doors opened. Julia felt it before she saw him. The shift in attention, the subtle change in the air. Footsteps approached with unhurried confidence. She lifted her eyes instinctively. Richard Carter entered the room. For a single, disorienting second, everything fractured. The controlled corporate setting blurred into memory. Dim lights, close proximity. The warmth of a hotel room just hours earlier. The man standing at the head of the table was unmistakable. The same height, the same presence, the same piercing blue eyes that had watched her from across a crowded dance floor. Their gazes locked. Recognition struck immediately and without mercy. Richard's expression did not change, but something flickered beneath the surface. Surprise, then calculation. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He turned his attention to the room, placing his hands lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm. Controlled, entirely professional. Julia's breath caught. The sound of her own pulse roared in her ears. She stared at the table in front of her, afraid that if she looked at him again, she would lose the fragile hold she had on herself. Richard introduced himself formally as the CEO of Titanium Holdings. His tone was distant, his posture composed. There was no acknowledgement of familiarity, no trace of the intimacy that had existed between them only hours ago. As he spoke, Julia felt the weight of the situation settle heavily over her. The realization pressed down with growing force. This was not just an uncomfortable coincidence. This was a mistake with consequences she had not allowed herself to consider. Richard's speech was precise and unyielding. He spoke of standards, expectations, and the culture of the company. Every word was measured. "Professionalism here is non-negotiable," he said, his gaze sweeping the room without lingering on any one face. "There will be no exceptions, no favoritism, no distractions." Julia's hands tightened around her pen. "We do not tolerate workplace relationships of any kind," Richard continued. "This includes personal involvement that compromises judgment, performance, or integrity." The words landed with quiet brutality. Julia felt exposed. even though no one else in the room could possibly know. Shame crept up her spine, sharp and suffocating. She kept her expression neutral, her body perfectly still, as if any movement might draw attention she could not afford. Richard finished his remarks and turned the meeting over to the program coordinator. Just like that, he stepped back, retreating into the role of executive, his presence receding without a backward glance. The introductions that followed felt distant, muffled. Julia heard her name spoken, heard her own voice respond, but it felt as though she were watching from far away. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closer. By the time the session ended, her thoughts were racing. She stood slowly, avoiding eye contact with anyone, her mind spiraling through questions she did not want to answer. How much did he remember? What did he think of her now? What would happen next? As she left the conference room and stepped into the hallway, the full weight of the morning pressed down on her. Julia felt trapped, caught between ambition and a decision she could not undo. Fear settled deep in her chest, cold and persistent. Yesterday, she had told herself the night did not matter. Standing there now, in the heart of Titanium Holdings, Julia understood how wrong she had been. The message arrived less than an hour later. Julia had barely settled at her temporary desk when her phone vibrated softly against the surface. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach tighten. A brief notification from the executive assistant's office, formal and impersonal, requested her presence on the top floor. Richard Carter wanted to see her. The walk to the elevator felt longer than it should have. Each step carried a weight she could not shake, a growing sense of dread that settled deep in her chest. By the time the elevator doors closed, Julia's hands were cold, her thoughts racing through possibilities she did not want to consider. Richard's office occupied a corner of the building, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The space was immaculate, restrained, and unmistakably powerful. When Julia entered, Richard was standing near the window, his back to her, the skyline stretched out behind him like a deliberate reminder of his position. He turned as the door closed. "Sit," he said calmly, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. Julia obeyed, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed. She refused to let him see how unsettled she felt. For a moment, Richard studied her in silence. There was no trace of the man from the night before. No warmth. No ease. Only calculation. "I'll be direct," he said finally. "What happened last night was not a coincidence." The words struck harder than Julia expected. "I didn't plan it," she replied immediately. "I didn't even know who you were." Richard's gaze sharpened. "You expect me to believe that you just happened to meet the CEO of Titanium Holdings in a private club the night before your first day?" Julia felt a flush of heat rise to her face. The accusation cut deep, not only because it was unfair, but because it reduced her to something she had never been. "I didn't orchestrate anything," she said, her voice steady despite the hurt spreading through her chest. "I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you worked. I didn't know anything." Richard exhaled slowly, as if weighing her words against his own assumptions. "You understand how this looks," he said, "and you understand the risk it creates. For me, for the company." Julia clenched her jaw. "I understand the risk. That doesn't make your conclusion true." Silence fell again, heavy and uncomfortable. When Richard spoke next, his tone was colder, more controlled. "This cannot exist. Not here. Not in any form." Julia felt her heart sink, even though she had known this was coming. "You have two options," he continued. "You forget last night entirely. You act as though it never happened. Or you leave the internship program." The words were delivered without hesitation, stripped of emotion. Julia stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. "You're asking me to pretend it didn't happen," she said quietly, "as if it didn't involve both of us." I'm protecting the company, Richard replied. And myself. And what about me? Julia asked. The question escaped before she could stop it. Richard paused, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. You're here because you earned your place, he said. Your academic record is exceptional. Your recommendations are strong. You're capable. That's why I'm giving you this choice. The implication was clear. Her value was conditional. Her future depended entirely on his judgment. Julia felt something fracture inside her. The injustice of it settled heavily, leaving behind a dull, aching sense of humiliation. She had worked for this opportunity. She had followed every rule. And now, a single night, one she had already tried to erase, threatened to undo everything. I didn't ask for special treatment, she said. And I didn't manipulate my way here. I'm not interested in motives, Richard replied. Only outcomes. He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. You're dismissed, he said. Make your decision. Julia rose on unsteady legs. She did not trust herself to speak again. As she walked toward the door, she felt smaller than she had moments earlier, stripped of certainty and control. The hallway outside felt colder than before. The polished floor reflected her image back at her, composed on the surface, shaken underneath. She returned to her desk and forced herself to focus. Though the words on her screen blurred together, she felt powerless, misunderstood, trapped between ambition and accusation. By the end of the day, the tension had begun to shift. Rebecca Stone watched her closely, her sharp gaze lingering just a moment too long. Small comments followed, subtle, cutting remarks delivered with a practiced smile. A file misplaced, a whispered observation shared just loudly enough to be heard. Julia felt it immediately. The atmosphere around her had changed. The warning in Richard's office had not stayed contained. And this was only the beginning. The project assignments were announced at the start of the following week. The interns gathered once again in a glass-walled conference room, notebooks open, attention sharpened. This time the mood was different. The initial excitement had been replaced by pressure. Everyone understood what this phase represented. This was no longer about selection. This was about survival. The coordinator outlined the task, a conceptual development proposal to be presented to senior leadership. It would test analytical ability, creativity, and understanding of the company's long-term vision. Pairs would be formed. Performance would be evaluated individually and jointly. Names were called in measured succession. When Julia heard her own name followed immediately by Richard Carter's, the room seemed to tilt slightly. She lifted her eyes, uncertain she had heard correctly. Richard did not look at her. There was a brief pause, a subtle shift of attention among the interns. Pairing a first-year intern directly with the CEO was unusual, bordering on unprecedented. No explanation was offered. None was needed. The decision had already been made. Julia felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She told herself to remain calm, to treat this like any other assignment. Still, the awareness of proximity, professional and otherwise, settled heavily between them. Their first working session was scheduled for later that afternoon. Richard's office remained unchanged, expansive, controlled, designed to reflect authority without excess. Julia sat across from him at the table, documents spread neatly in front of her. She waited, unsure whether to speak first. "Show me what you've been thinking," Richard said at last. Julia took a quiet breath and opened her folder. She spoke carefully at first, outlining market research, zoning considerations and cost structures. Then, gradually, her voice gained confidence. She introduced her central concept, a rehabilitation center integrated into a mixed-use development designed for individuals with long-term mobility challenges. "It's not just about accessibility," she said. "It's about dignity, independence, long-term community integration. Richard leaned back slightly, his attention fully engaged now. Julia continued, describing adaptive living spaces, physical therapy facilities, and public areas designed to encourage interaction rather than isolation. She spoke not from theory alone, but from lived experience. "My mother was injured years ago," she said, her voice steady but quieter. "She uses a wheelchair. Most spaces aren't built for people like her." "Not really." For a moment, the room was silent. Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be unmistakable. The guarded executive demeanor softened, replaced by something closer to genuine interest. "This is thoughtful," he said, "and grounded." Julia nodded, relieved. "It's practical, and it's needed." They worked for nearly 2 hours without interruption. Ideas were exchanged, challenged, refined. The dynamic shifted subtly. Richard listened. Julia responded. The power imbalance remained, but something else threaded through it now. Mutual respect. Later that week, Richard suggested they continue the discussion over lunch. They chose a quiet restaurant, not far from the office. It was discreet, businesslike, neutral. Still, Julia felt the weight of the situation as they sat across from each other, menus untouched for several minutes. They spoke first about the project, about timelines, about presentation strategy. Only gradually did the conversation drift elsewhere. Julia found herself speaking again about her mother, about the accident, the long recovery, the quiet resilience that followed. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply told the truth. Richard listened closely, his expression unreadable but attentive. "You didn't mention this before," he said. "There was no reason to," Julia replied. "Until now." She hesitated, then added, "It's why the project matters to me." Something in the air shifted. The emotional distance between them narrowed, almost imperceptibly, not because of attraction, but because of understanding. Still, beneath it all, fear lingered. Neither of them named it. Neither of them acknowledged the risk. Back at the office, the atmosphere had begun to turn. Rebecca watched Julia constantly now. Her politeness had thinned, replaced by barely concealed irritation. Comments grew sharper. Assistance was withheld. Opportunities to undermine Julia's competence were seized without hesitation. Julia noticed. She felt the tension tightening around her, even as her professional confidence grew. She understood instinctively that success would not come without consequence, and somewhere beneath the surface, unseen cracks were beginning to form. The truth surfaced quietly without warning. Julia discovered it not at the office, but at home. On a Friday evening, she had intended to spend resting after another exhausting week. She had stopped by her mother's apartment with groceries, moving through familiar rooms with practiced ease, when a name caught her attention. Catherine Carter. It was written on an old photograph tucked inside a drawer Julia had opened by accident while looking for a charger. The photo was faded at the edges. 2 young women standing side by side, their faces unmistakably related. One of them was her mother. The other was Catherine, decades younger, but unmistakable even then. Julia stood still, the room suddenly too quiet. When she asked, her mother did not deny it. Catherine was her biological aunt. The story came out slowly, in fragments heavy with years of restraint. There had been a betrayal long ago, one that fractured the family beyond repair. Words spoken that could not be taken back. A choice made at a moment when pride outweighed loyalty. Catherine had walked away, severing all ties, choosing ambition and distance over reconciliation. Years of silence followed. No calls, no letters, no explanations. Julia listened, stunned, a cold realization spreading through her chest. Every harsh look, every cold order, every moment of pressure at Titanium Holdings now carried a different weight. Catherine had known. The confrontation happened the next morning. Julia did not plan it carefully. She did not rehearse her words. She simply showed up at Catherine's office, her posture rigid, her face pale but resolute. Catherine looked up from her desk, irritation flashing briefly before it was replaced by something else: recognition, calculation, control. "So," Catherine said quietly, "you know." Julia did not sit. "You've known who I was from the beginning." "Yes," Catherine replied without hesitation. "Why?" Julia asked. Her voice did not rise, but it trembled all the same. "Why put me through this?" Catherine's expression hardened. "Because favoritism would have been a greater betrayal, and because the past doesn't entitle anyone to exceptions." Julia felt something break inside her, not loudly but decisively. "This wasn't about fairness," she said. "This was about punishment." Catherine did not deny it. Julia left the office without another word. By the end of the day, she had made her decision. She typed her resignation letter carefully, choosing clarity over accusation, dignity over explanation. It was brief, professional, and final. When she submitted it, she felt both relief and grief. Richard asked to see her immediately. She entered his office expecting resistance, perhaps disappointment. What she found instead was stillness. He read the letter once, then again. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes," Julia replied. "I can't stay." Richard studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something unseen. "I won't stop you," he said at last. Julia blinked, unprepared. "This environment has become compromised," he continued, "for reasons beyond your control. Leaving does not diminish your talent." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were contact details, names, companies, opportunities. "I'll support you professionally," Richard said. "Anywhere else." Julia swallowed. "Why?" "Because you earned it," he answered. "And because sometimes walking away is the only way to keep your integrity intact." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. When Julia walked out of Titanium Holdings for the final time, she did not rush. She did not look back. She carried herself with quiet resolve, her expression composed, her dignity intact. Yet inside nothing was settled. The night they had shared, the trust that never had a chance to form, the family truth that had come too late, all of it lingered, unresolved, aching beneath the surface. Julia had chosen herself, but the fracture remained. The first signs were easy to dismiss. Fatigue, nausea in the mornings, a sensitivity to smells that made ordinary routines suddenly unbearable. Julia told herself it was stress, the aftermath of leaving Titanium Holdings, the emotional toll of everything that had unraveled so quickly. But the symptoms persisted. When the test confirmed what her body already knew, Julia sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, the small plastic stick trembling in her hand. She was pregnant. The realization brought no immediate joy, only a rush of conflicting emotions: fear, disbelief, protectiveness, and an unexpected sense of calm. Whatever had gone wrong in her life, this was real. This was hers. She did not tell Richard right away. Days turned into weeks. Julia focused on work at her new firm, on doctor appointments, on keeping her life stable. She avoided familiar streets, familiar memories. Still, the truth had a way of surfacing. Richard found out by accident. He had come to see her unannounced one evening, concern written plainly on his face. One look at the fatigue she could no longer hide, at the way she instinctively rested a hand over her abdomen, and the pieces fell into place. "You're pregnant," he said quietly. Julia did not deny it. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, with the certainty of a man used to decisive action, he spoke. "We'll get married." The words landed heavily between them. "This child deserves stability," he continued. "My name, protection, security." Julia looked at him steadily. "And love." Richard hesitated. "I won't marry out of obligation," Julia said. Her voice was calm but unwavering. I won't teach my child that responsibility replaces honesty. I care about you, Richard replied. That's not the same thing, she said. Not for me. She allowed him a place in the child's life, nothing more. He would be involved, present, accountable, but not her husband. Richard accepted her decision outwardly, though it was clear it unsettled him. Still, for the first time, their interactions felt honest. Fragile but honest. Someone else was watching. Rebecca had never forgiven Julia for leaving Titanium Holdings with her reputation intact. She had expected disgrace, silence. Instead, Julia had moved forward quietly, gracefully, and that infuriated her. When Rebecca learned of the pregnancy, resentment hardened into obsession. She waited for an opportunity. It came one night when Richard stopped by a private club for a brief meeting. Rebecca made sure she was there. A drink offered, a smile carefully timed, a substance slipped where it would not be noticed. Richard remembered little after that. What followed was calculated precision. Rebecca positioned him unconscious. In her apartment, she staged the scene carefully. Rumpled sheets, dim lighting, suggestive angles. She took photographs designed to imply intimacy, betrayal, proof. Then she vanished. Julia received the message the next morning. The photos loaded slowly on her phone. When they finally appeared, her breath caught painfully in her chest. Richard, barely conscious, Rebecca beside him. The implication was unmistakable. Julia felt something inside her collapse. Not loudly, completely. She did not call him. She did not ask for an explanation. She believed what she saw. Across the city, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Richard woke in darkness, his throat tight, his skin burning. His breathing grew labored, each breath more difficult than the last. An allergic reaction, severe, escalating, triggered by a substance he had not knowingly consumed. He collapsed before he could reach his phone. Hours passed before a neighbor, alerted by an unanswered call, forced entry and found him barely conscious. Emergency services arrived quickly. Paramedics administered medication, stabilizing him enough to transport him to the hospital. The diagnosis was serious but survivable. By the time Richard regained full awareness, Rebecca was gone. Her apartment was empty, her phone disconnected, no forwarding address, only the evidence she had left behind, and the damage already done. Julia learned of his collapse through a third party. The news reached her late, incomplete, stripped of context. She did not go to the hospital. She sat alone instead, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, tears falling silently as she tried to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the images burned into her memory. Danger had passed, but trust lay in ruins. Richard woke to white ceilings and the rhythmic pulse of machines. His throat burned. His head throbbed. The air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. For a moment, he did not understand where he was. Then fragments returned, darkness, breath failing, the sharp panic of not being able to move. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing a chart. "You had a severe allergic reaction," she said when she noticed his eyes open. "Not accidental. Toxicology confirms you were drugged." The word landed with weight. Poisoned. Police arrived later that morning. Questions followed. Where he had been, who he had seen, what he remembered. Richard answered as best he could, his voice hoarse, his patience thin. Surveillance footage filled in the rest. A private club. A drink unattended for seconds. Rebecca's presence. Her apartment. The staged photographs. By the end of the day, there was no doubt. Rebecca Stone was arrested attempting to leave the state. The news reached Julia through Catherine, who called with uncharacteristic urgency. The facts came fast, stripped of emotion. Drugging, false evidence, hospitalization, arrest. Julia listened in silence. When the call ended, her legs gave out beneath her. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, hands shaking, breath shallow. The images she had believed without question replayed in her mind, now stripped of their meaning, now exposed as a lie. The weight of it crushed her. She cried then, openly, uncontrollably, for the fear she had carried alone, for the trust she had buried, for the man she had judged without hearing his voice, for the child she was carrying. Caught in the fallout of adult mistakes, she went to the hospital that evening. Richard was awake when she entered the room, thinner, paler, but unmistakably himself. Their eyes met, and the space between them filled with everything left unsaid. "I didn't touch her," he said quietly. "I never would have." Julia nodded, tears spilling despite her attempt at composure. "I know." He explained everything as clearly as his strength allowed. The drink, the blackout, waking unable to breathe, the fear. He did not dramatize. He did not defend himself. He told the truth and waited. Julia sat beside him, her hand resting on the edge of the bed. She listened until there was nothing left to explain. "I should have asked," she said finally. "I should have given you a chance to speak." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "And I should have trusted you enough to be honest from the beginning. About my past. About my fears." They spoke then, not as a CEO and a former intern. Not as people bound by circumstance, but as two adults stripped of pretense. Richard admitted how deeply the betrayal years earlier had scarred him, how it had trained him to expect manipulation where there was none. Julia admitted how quickly she had learned to rely only on herself, how vulnerability felt like danger. They had misjudged each other, and they had both paid for it. "I don't want obligation," Julia said, her voice steady now. "I don't want fear dressed up as responsibility." "I don't want distance," Richard replied. "I don't want to hide behind control." Silence settled, not heavy but thoughtful. Trust did not return all at once. It did not repair itself with apologies or explanations, but something fragile and real began to form in its place. Richard reached for Julia's hand. This time she did not pull away. The investigation moved quickly. Evidence was undeniable. Rebecca's actions were documented, deliberate, criminal. She faced charges that would follow her for years. When Richard was discharged days later, Julia was there. They left the hospital together, not triumphant, not resolved, but aligned. For the first time, they were facing forward without illusions. The crisis had passed. What remained was the choice to rebuild, slowly, honestly, and without lies. They did not rush back into each other's lives. After the hospital, Julia and Richard chose something unfamiliar to both of them: patience. They spoke often, sometimes about the future, sometimes only about the present day. There were no grand promises, no declarations meant to erase the past. What bound them now was honesty, quiet, deliberate, and unforced. Richard showed up, not with control or authority, but with consistency. He attended appointments. He listened. He learned when to speak and when to simply stay. Julia allowed herself slowly to believe that care did not always come with conditions attached. By the time winter turned into spring, the fear that had once lived between them had softened into trust. Their daughter was born on a clear morning, the kind that made the city feel gentler than usual. Julia held her first, overwhelmed by a love that arrived without hesitation or doubt. Richard stood beside her, tears unguarded, his hand trembling as he touched the small, perfect weight of their child. Nothing in his life had ever felt more real. They named her simply, meaningfully, a name that did not carry expectations, only hope. Julia's mother, who had spent years withdrawn behind pain and disappointment, surprised everyone most of all. With the arrival of her granddaughter, something inside her shifted. She laughed more. She spoke more freely. With proper therapy and renewed purpose, she began not only emotional recovery, but physical progress as well. Slow steps forward, literal and figurative. For the first time in years, the apartment felt alive. Catherine came last. The reconciliation was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no sudden absolution. There was only a quiet afternoon, a shared table, and words that had waited too long to be spoken. "I made choices I thought were necessary," Catherine said, her voice steady but strict of authority. "They cost more than I admitted." Julia listened, not as a subordinate, not as an intern, but as family. Forgiveness did not arrive instantly, but it arrived honestly. Catherine stepped back from control and into presence. She showed up for birthdays, for appointments, for ordinary moments. Over time, the sharp edges softened. The family became something new, not perfect but real. Richard and Julia built their life deliberately, not around titles or expectations, but around routines that mattered. Morning walks, shared meals, evenings where the city faded into background noise and family took its place. There were challenges, there were disagreements, but there were no secrets. In time, Titanium Holdings became a closed chapter, important, formative, but no longer defining. Julia continued her work elsewhere, driven by the same conviction that had shaped her first project. Richard supported her not as a benefactor, but as a partner. The past did not disappear. It did not need to. It had done its work. On a quiet evening, Julia stood at the window holding her daughter, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Richard joined her, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders. They did not speak. They did not need to. What they had now was not the product of chance or impulse, but of choice, earned slowly, carefully, and together. And that was enough.